Scenarios. Today we'll introduce and cover scenarios. So far we've done many steps in the process outlined in the slide: assumptions in a system map, weak signals and insights, and change drivers in our insight sharing exercise last session. Today we'll understand how to build scenarios and understand how scenarios can be used to make better policy. What is a scenario? Scenarios are descriptions of plausible alternative futures. To some, scenarios are synonymous with foresight. However, as you've seen, there's a lot more to foresight than scenario development. In the Horizons foresight method, scenarios are used as a way to visualize how the system evolves as it interacts with drivers that create new and unexpected changes. The objective of scenarios design is not to predict the future. Scenarios allow users to explore a range of plausible futures that we may live through. They also allow us to identify potential challenges and opportunities that could emerge, and to develop robust strategies that may help cope with these surprises. Scenarios normally have a defined time limit, like 2030. Or 2035. Horizon's timeframe for scenarios is normally 10 to 15 years into the future. Scenarios can be developed and presented in many different ways. They can be described using words, graphics, pictures, videos, and other methods. Structural scenarios describe what is happening in the future at a systems level. That is, what is happening in the future world. This is a brief summary of what is going on in different parts of the system in 2035, and how it is different than today. Narrative scenarios describe a scenario through the eyes of a person living through it. The person can be an abstract observer or a persona. A persona is a fictional person who represents a segment of the population in the real world. For instance, in the Future of Work group, seniors would be one of our populations. Rather than just take my dad and put him in the future, we might interview 4 seniors and create a composite person from different interviews. Design scholars emphasize that you want to construct personas from the words of interviewees, not from your own, perhaps biased perceptions. Finally, Horizons and other futurists have experimented with experiential futures, such as Horizons Ex Futura. Experiential scenarios can include role-playing, games, and scenes with a collection of artifacts. What makes a good scenario? In a perfect world, scenarios would have all of these characteristics. Multiple futures. Scenarios don't merely examine one future, but explore a range of futures. Plausible. Scenarios remain plausible. Lower likelihood developments in each scenario are reasonable and defensible. We also don't want to neglect changes that will plausibly happen in each scenario, like more and better internet, or now there's telepresence. Non-linear. Scenarios go beyond simple extensions of the present, A causes B, to explore spiraling complexity. Provocative. Scenarios explore the significant issues in a vivid and strategic manner that grabs the audience's attention. Explores assumptions. Scenarios move beyond conventional thinking to challenge current assumptions about the future. Concise and clear. Scenarios convey images more than facts. Scenario components are at the same level of generality, and they contain the essence of the message rather than details. What are the steps in scenario building? There are 3 principal steps in the Horizons method. 1. Identify some change drivers and some system elements from the structural systems map that will inform scenario development. 2. Develop the scenario logic. 3. Then put it all together to create the structural scenarios. Once they are developed, scenarios can be used to identify potential policy challenges and opportunities. We can also use scenarios to help test commonly held assumptions of a system under study, which can be useful in crafting robust policy assumptions. Let's go through these steps in turn to explain what we mean. Step 1. Identify key change drivers and elements for analysis. Through scanning, participants develop a good understanding of the system and collect insights about what is changing. This knowledge helps us select change drivers that matter and system elements that may change between now and our scenario period. Change drivers are the forcers or drivers of change in the system. The elements from the structural systems map are where change plays out. For instance, in a scenario about the changing nature of work, one change driver might be the introduction of telepresence. A system element might be knowledge work or office work. Knowledge work can change due to telepresence robots by moving away from where people live to around the world. Finding the right combinations of drivers and system elements and the right level of abstraction so they interact in ways that are strategically useful is an art. Influence cascades and cross-impact work may give participants a better sense of where and how significant change could occur. For Canada Beyond 150, we are hoping each group can come up with 3 or more change drivers to help shape different scenarios. We'd also like to pick 3 or more elements from the structural systems map to build scenarios. You don't have to use all of the drivers or system elements. You may find the complexity goes up without a lot of new insight being generated. Step 2. Developing the scenario logic. A scenario logic is the hook for a scenario, the central conceit that glues a scenario together. In terms of popular TV, you could think of it as a title, like this is the one where Ross finds out Rachel's feelings for him, or this is the one where winter is coming, or this is the one with the election between Kang and Kodos. At Horizons, our scenarios start with archetypes, reference ideas that explore alternative futures in the cone of plausibility. Archetypes provide a wide spectrum against which to test possible future strategies, highlighting potential policy challenges and opportunities, and thereby allowing decision makers to design more resilient strategies. These 4 archetypes have proved useful in public policy foresight, muddling through, incremental progress, incremental decline, and transformation. Each generic archetype is supplemented with a line of scenario logic that help define the scenario. This helps place boundaries on the scenario, which makes exploring plausible futures easier. This slide provides a more in-depth explanation of the 4 archetypes that have proved useful in public policy foresight. Muddling through, coping with or reacting to change, but without improving outcomes. Incremental progress. Things are getting better, but in an incremental way. Incremental decline. Current arrangements are hard to sustain and things are getting worse, without necessarily being catastrophic. We don't often focus on dramatic negative events in our work at Horizons, such as a major nationwide disaster or the global economic crisis. These are rare events, and when they do occur, most of the calendar time takes place before or after the major event. This brings us to transformation. Things change due to fundamental shifts in the way we work or see the problem. Transformation is often a response to an opportunity or a crisis. It can be either positive or negative. With all that in mind, let's have a look at some scenario logics. Example of scenario logic. Here's a part of the scenario logic that we used for the Future of Asia project. In this chart, the basic archetypal logic, that is, the first 2 rows, are supplemented with an additional line of logic that help put boundaries on each scenario by defining key characteristics of the scenario. The choice of what to include in the scenario logic is a judgment call based on what is worth exploring. The scenario logic here helps address the major changes that make the scenarios different. Finally, we come to step 3, building the structural scenarios. This is a picture of a structural scenario. We list the 4 archetypes across the top, then write down the scenario logic for each archetype. We then write in the change drivers and system elements that we chose. Here, we pick change drivers and elements from the Future of Asia study. We then think about the change drivers that we added to build the scenario. How do they look in each scenario, keeping in mind the particular scenario logic? For instance, some scenarios may have higher rates of telepresence, while another might not look very different than today. Maybe telepresence didn't change much in the incremental decline scenario, or maybe very high levels of telepresence is how you got to an incremental decline. In these cells, you can put content from your influence cascades and cross-impact matrices. This is where a lot of that thinking about the future content goes. We then look at the lenses we get from the system map. Each cell is implicitly a question about the scenario, and some of the answers may be elements or ideas that you've had in your engagements, influence cascades, and cross-impact work. We find that it is easier to work across the scenarios when thinking about the change drivers. This allows us to explore how the same change driver may react differently under different scenario logics. We then work down when we get to system elements, keeping in mind the interaction of all change drivers in the particular scenario and exploring their impacts on the particular system element. Finally, we look down each column of the scenario table to build one scenario, one plausible future. At the November event, we will add new rows for policy challenges and opportunities. From structural to narrative scenarios, the Horizons Foresight method usually results in 2 scenario products. 1. Structural scenarios, as described earlier. Structural scenarios are great analytical tools for identifying challenges, opportunities, and surprises. The scenario template is filled in. This can result in a matrix that is approximately 4 columns by 10 to 20 rows. The matrix offers a detailed description of each future. Or 2. Narrative scenarios. The narrative scenario often consists of the scenario logic and the key disruptions and surprises that are characteristic of each scenario. Narrative scenarios are more visceral and therefore helpful communication tools. For example, they can be used to lead a group through a guided imaging exercise to get them into the future space and then to identify possible implications. They can also be used to communicate findings more broadly. The structural scenarios are distilled down to give readers a feel for the 4 alternative futures without the detail. This can take the form of short 1-paragraph scenarios or scenarios that are 1 to 2 pages in length.